Chapter 2, Beginnings of English America, 1607 to 1660. Last chapter we covered who all was here. We've got the French to the north. We've got the Netherlands, little small area in the New York City area. And you've got the Spanish claiming pretty much everything else. But there is a strip of land between that nobody seems to want. It doesn't seem to be anything there. So this is where England's going to focus her attention. But I want to take a quick look at what's going on in Europe, particularly in England, just a little bit prior to our time period of 1600. Now, most of this info is not in your text. I'll let you know when it's time. Now, this is a map of Europe, of course, in 1648, and as you can see, Spain, Portugal, France, and England, they're pretty much settled. Italy is still a disorganized group of states, with their large city-states being the ones that are the most powerful. This whole area in through here called the Holy Roman Empire, as you can see, it's neither Holy Roman or an empire. It's a group of, shall we say, isolated, self-contained German city-states, each with their own ruler, although they have the Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor, he doesn't have that much power. And of course, this is the world. Now, the area we're going to be discussing, of course, is what we call the Old World. This whole area is called the Old World. But right in through here, as you can see, very small area of land. This is the Old World. North, Central, and South America is considered the New World. And there's a lot of water in between. The first thing we got to do is get England together. In the 1500s, England really wasn't even a second-rate power. She's kind of a third-rate power. There was always fighting between the big houses about who's going to run England, who's going to be the king of all of England. And the legendary King Arthur is just that. There was one war that started in the early 1400s. It was called the War of the Roses because each house had a different rose as their symbol, white and red. The houses of Lancaster and the houses of York. Well, in 1485 it ends with Henry of Lancaster marrying Elizabeth of York. This cemented the treaty and also began a new dynasty of one ruler for England, the Tudor dynasty. So Henry VII and Elizabeth, they had 7 children. 3 of them did not make it to adulthood. The 4th that lived was Arthur, the oldest son, named after the legendary Arthur. He marries a Spanish princess named Catherine. Now Henry, he's the second son, but he's a fun-loving son. He's a fun prince. He's good looking, he loves to hunt, he loves to ride, he writes songs, he plays music. He is thoroughly enjoying being the son of the king and no responsibilities. The 2 girls, Margaret and Mary, of course, were used as treaty makers, Margaret being married to the King of Scotland and Mary marrying the King of France. Well, we've got to get Arthur married. We've got to get some chillins around here, if you would. So Arthur, at the age of 14, was betrothed to Catherine of Spain, which took a lot of doing because Spain at this time was the richest country in the world. And they weren't real happy with marrying off one of their girls to a country just barely new when you get right down to it. But they did work it out, and the dowry that came with Catherine was, humongous. I've got several ships of goods, but there were dozens of ships of goods and gold and jewels. They get there. Well, November the 5th in 1501, they get married. And less than 5 months later, young Arthur dies. Well, Arthur had never been a healthy child. They said he had consumption, which is a fancy name for tuberculosis. But whatever it was, he dies. Now King Henry VII is in a quandary. What he was supposed to have done was take the widow Catherine and the dowry that he'd received and send it all back to Spain. But he didn't want to turn loose of that money. I mean, with the money and the dowry, he could run the country for 10, 20 years. What are we going to do? Well, he'd like to have Catherine marry his next son, Henry. But according to the laws of the church at the time, the brother-in-law could not marry the widow. So they got to figuring out something and finally figured out, well, maybe since, Arthur was so sick, and we know they didn't have a wedding night because they got married and they each went to a different castle, maybe the marriage had not been consummated. And if the marriage was not consummated, then it was okay for Henry to marry the widow. So they explain to the Pope and get all the necessary paperwork, and the Pope gives them a special dispensation to get married. So in 1504, just 2 years after Arthur had died, young Henry, the future King of England, is now going to marry his brother's widow. Now, this picture of Henry VII, or Henry VIII, he was about 30 years old when this was painted. When he was younger, he had long, reddish blonde hair. He was, like I say, the fun prince. Everybody loved him. And we've read articles in papers from other, shall we say, diplomats, commenting on that young Henry was almost too pretty to be a man. And Catherine of Aragon was a beautiful woman. Even as bad as the paintings were in those days, you can see her beauty shining through. Well, in 1509, Henry VII dies, and now young Henry, who never wanted to be king in the first place, at the age of 17, Henry VIII becomes King of England. He has not been prepared. His younger brother had been given all the education, and he's only had a year or two of training, if you would, such as, diplomacy and languages and things like that. But he did become king, and he had a lot of good help, and he goes ahead and marries Catherine, who is actually 4 years older than he is. Now, as near as we can figure out from all the documentation, they had a pretty happy marriage, considering he was king and queen. Catherine did her duty. She got pregnant 7 times, but she only had 1 child that lived. The others were either stillborn or miscarried. He had a girl, and they named her Mary. And during his entire 20 years, Henry only had 2 mistresses, for considering the time frame and the fact he was a king, kind of conservative. But England was very, very Catholic at this time, and Henry even earned a commendation from the Pope for defending religion, because it was during this time frame that young Martin Luther reared his head. Now, in the beginning, Martin Luther didn't want to be a monk or a priest. He was studying to be a lawyer, because that's where the money was. One day he was on his way home from school, and he got caught in a really bad thunderstorm. There was lightning and thunder, and the wind was blowing, and he thought he was going to die. So he prayed to God. He said, "Save me, and I'll devote my life to God." Well, the storm passed, and he was saved, of course. And he kept his word. He left the school to be a lawyer and became a monk. He enrolled in the University of Wittenberg, got a PhD, and started teaching and doing research. He did so much research, he finally came to the conclusion that, man didn't need all this ceremony and things that you had to go through in the Catholic Church. You didn't need to go to confession and do penance. You could find salvation with God through faith alone. And he's having a hard time with this. Then he looks around the Catholic Church, and at this time the Catholic Church is rather corrupt. And they're trying to raise money to build a new cathedral, and they start selling what we discussed a little bit last time, selling these indulgences. Well, he thought this was wrong. So he has 95 different things he thinks the church is doing wrong, and he writes them down and he posts them on the door of the church at Wittenberg. And again, it's the Protestant Reformation, although this is not what he intended. He just wanted the church to correct itself. Meanwhile, Henry's in his late 30s. He needs a male heir. Now, Catherine and he had been rather close. She was very highly educated, far beyond her station as a woman. She was interested in the ruling of the kingdom. They discussed things. And he did not blame her for no son at first. But in 1825, he's in his early 30s, been 20 years almost. A young maid in waiting named Anne catches to Henry's eyes. Now, Henry, we firmly believe that Anne had a lot to do with it. Began to believe that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, because she had lied. She was really not a virgin when he married her. That marriage had been consummated. So what do you got to do? You got to get it annulled. But his wife is a Spanish princess, the Holy Roman Emperor, her nephew, and the Pope is Spanish. There's no way he's going to get an annulment. You'd have about as much chance as a snowball in Hades. The church would not grant him an annulment, no matter what he did and no matter how many ministers he got working on it. So he said, okay, I'll just leave the church. So he did so, and he established what was called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, with the king as head of the church. That's the only thing that changed. We still had priests, we still had services, we still had the same prayers, we still had the same policies. Everything's the same, except now the king is the head of the church and not the pope. Well, the one other thing changed. All this money that they've been sending to Rome now stayed in England. And as soon as he's the head of the church, he grants himself an annulment. Well, Anne, it's not a very attractive picture. From everything it said, she was a very attractive woman and just full of wit and style. And he tried to make her his mistress, but she refused, even though her sister had also been his mistress. She demanded that the king marry her before they have connubial bliss. It took 7 years. He finally got the annulment. He gets to thinking, well, you know, France is just across the English Channel. What if the king of France is very Catholic and upset? Well, we don't want a war with France. So he persuades Anne to go with him to visit the king of France. So they get on a boat and they cross the channel and they go over to visit the king of France. And king of France says he really couldn't care less one way or the other. And it's during this time period that Anne finally succumbs to the king's demands. Because when they came back to England, she was already with child. So they get married. And he crowns her his queen, even though she's very obviously pretty far along. Unfortunately, the child was a girl. Well, this didn't set too good, but she's young. They could have more children. And when Queen Catherine died in 1536, oh, she was just happy as a bug in a rug. And she was also pregnant. So the day Catherine dies, she goes running to the king, just, you know, hey, you know what, Catherine's gone, there's no more problems. And she bursts in the king's chamber, and there sits Jane Seymour, one of her maids-in-waiting, sitting on the lap of the king. And Anne threw a ringtail fit. She ranted and raved and called the king name and called Jane Seymour names and runs back to her room. And that evening she had a miscarriage. The child, it was a boy, it was a male child. What Anne had done was seal her own fate, signed her own death warrant, so to speak. You just don't do that to the king, not when the king has the power of life and death. Well, they had Anne arrested, tried, convicted, and beheaded. So in 1533 she was married and crowned Queen of England. And she gave birth to the one child that lived named Elizabeth. 3 years later, Catherine, the original Queen of England, dies. And with her outburst, she was executed. She was queen for 3 very short years. Incest, they accused her of having relations with her brother. And her brother, after, shall we say, a rather intense interrogation, admitted to it. It was nobody believed it, not even the king, but they had to have some kind of reason to behead her. Now, this young woman, Jane Seymour, was very meek, not really attractive, but she was just a nice person. She was content to stay in the background. He married her just 10 days after the execution, and she was never crowned. But she was pregnant, and she died very shortly while she was having a baby, and it was a male child. Well, time goes by, and he decides he needs another wife. He's already got 3. So somehow, in this picture on the left, Anne of Cleves, is not the picture that he received. He received the picture of a very plump, very pretty little blonde girl from the Netherlands. And that's okay, but he would marry her. So they bring her to England, and she doesn't speak English, and she doesn't know who the king is. She doesn't know what's going on, and he bursts into the room looking for this pretty little girl he was supposed to find, and he finds this very plain, not attractive woman who was afraid of him and won't talk to him, didn't know who he was. So he says, we got to get out of this, and he's told that you can't get out of it. You've already made a treaty with her father. You've got to marry her. So he married her and never had a wedding night, never consummated the marriage. And meanwhile, she's happy. He comes to see her, and he kisses her on the forehead, and he leaves. And she can't understand why she's not pregnant. That's how dumb she was. She didn't know the facts of life. Well, as she learns the English language and learns what's going on and hears about the other 3 wives, When the king asked her for a divorce, she very eagerly said yes. So he divorced the Anne of Cleves because he's the king of the king, and then, they have the church. He can do this. He sets her up in a castle, and he treats her like a sister for the rest of his life. She's invited to court functions, but never anything more. So meanwhile, he's getting older, and he starts visiting around his contemporaries in the other castles, and he comes across a young woman named Catherine Howard. And she's only 16, but Catherine Howard is a slut. She would sleep with any man. She didn't care whether he was a peasant, whether he was a nobleman, or what he was. She's like, well, I think the term would be nymphomaniac. But of course, everybody was afraid to tell the king that Catherine was not a virgin, because in his eyes, she was a beautiful virgin rose, and he married her. Well, the court is living in constant fear of what's going to happen when the king finds out that his queen, well, when they went back to the castle after the marriage, she took 2 of her boyfriends with her. One of them was a guy that worked with horses, and the other one, what was the other? Another one was a tutor of something. He was some kind of a teacher. She took them both with her. Everybody knows she's sleeping around, except the king. And one day the king walks in at an inopportune time and finds his wife, the queen, in bed with someone else. She is arrested, tried for treason because she has cockled the king, and is beheaded. Well, now he's getting old. He's up there. He's in his 40s. He's getting fat. He looks more like the pictures that you see of him now. He's got gout, can't walk. But he marries again, and this time he marries young Catherine Howard, who is a very beautiful woman and a 2-time widow, as a matter of fact. And she's more of a nurse than a wife, and she's good to both of his girls that's still alive, Mary and Elizabeth. But she has some radical religious views, and this gets her in a little bit of trouble, but she learns to keep her mouth shut and stay out of the way. She never argues with Henry. And then Henry dies, and she's free to marry for the 4th time. So January 28th, 1547, Henry dies. Now the young boy Edward is king, 9 years old. And of course he's too young to be king, so he has a regent, and it's all... As much as Edward tries to Protestantize the church, it's just not working. But he was the king, if you would, for 6 years, and he dies. Well, now what are we going to do? Who's going to run? There's only 2 children of Henry left, and they're both girls. One of them's a Catholic, one of them's a Protestant. But there is a distant cousin who's a Protestant who would probably be more acceptable to the people. So you've got 3 fractions trying to become the rulers of England. Without going into a lot of detail, Queen Mary makes it to London first with her supporters and becomes, at the age of 37, Queen of England. Well, she knows that she's getting older, and the first thing she wants to do is get married and have babies. So they make a deal with Philip of Spain. She marries Prince Philip. Prince Philip came over. He's a young man. He's in his 20s. He takes one look at this older woman, and the day after they got married, he went back to Madrid. Mary decides to take the country back to being Catholic. And if you won't change your faith from Protestant to Catholic, well, she has massive burnings. Those that could left England. They're called Marian exiles because they left under Queen Mary. They were Protestants who could afford to flee. They called her Bloody Mary. Philip stays in Spain, and I have read some of the letters that she wrote to him. She was madly in love with this man. She begged him to come back. Meanwhile, she starts having false pregnancies. Her stomach would swell, her breast would swell, and it looked like she was pregnant until we get to the time of having the baby, and then there would be no child. So she dies childless, just 4 years into her reign. We've come to the conclusion that she was having ovarian cancer. That's what the problem was. But she dies. Now what are we going to do? Now there is Philip II of Spain, and he was a good-looking young dude and very egotistical. So these are 2 just separate portraits of Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the Protestant child, and she was not an attractive older woman, but she was going to decide to be the Virgin Queen and not get married because she knew once she got married, all attention and power would go to her husband. Under her reign, England begins to prosper, and the Marian exiles return. And what they do when they come back, they want to purify the church and became known as Puritans. She dies childless in 1603 and has to name somebody, so she names her distant cousin, King James VI of Scotland, king. Ends the Tudor dynasty and starts another dynasty called the Stuart dynasty. So James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. And just for FYI, James I of England, or James VI of Scotland, was Mary, Queen of Scots' son, and we won't want to go down that road. Excuse me. Now, England has become Protestant, very, very Protestant. But meanwhile, the country that they control, called Ireland, well, they're very, very Catholic, and they seem to be a threat to England, so England uses the military to kill them. They kill civilians, they killed fighting men. They introduced the English economic practices over there, and they call the Irish either barbaric or the wild Irish. But the Irish are stubborn. They refuse to respect English authority. They refuse to convert to Protestantism. And during this time frame of English rule, tens of thousands of Irishmen were sold into slavery to the islands in the Caribbean. And then England's going to use the same tactics to try to settle the New World, military and being barbaric. Okay, now we're getting into what we call the text material. You've got the background, you know what's going on. And under Queen Elizabeth, they began to look at North America. Now, no matter what you say, we know that Queen Elizabeth, although known as the Virgin Queen, and Virginia being named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth was not a virgin. She had many lovers. One of her ex-lovers was Sir Walter Raleigh. And she gave him permission to settle in the New World. But of course, they were more interested in raiding and robbing the Spanish treasure ships than they were in settling a colony. They tried 2 times, Roanoke Island and Newfoundland, to settle colonies, and both of them were failures. Now, Roanoke was attempted in 1587. And they brought colonists over. They were going to actually settle. They brought, one of them was John White, and we'll see if some art that he's drawn. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was the first English child born in the New World. But he had to go back to England to get some supplies. Unfortunately, if you know anything about European history, the English and the Spanish are going to have a war. And it was during a war with Spain, when they sunk the Spanish Armada, that when he got to England, Elizabeth wouldn't let any ships leave. They needed all their ships to fight the Spanish. It took him 3 years before he could get back to Roanoke Island. And when he got back, the colony was deserted. And I think we still do have some kind of a commemoration or something up in North Carolina every year over what happened to Roanoke. This is some of his sketches, so you can see they're beautifully done. Glory, profit, religious zeal. The Protestant Reformation created in the English people the belief that the Catholic Spain was their mortal enemy, and we must rescue the Indians from the evil Spanish Empire. And a Protestant minister named Richard, I'm going to murder his last name, Hyluk, he gave a sermon and wrote out why 23 different reasons why the Crown should support colonization in the New World. And number 1 being to save the Indians from Catholicism and the Spanish cruelty. And if we do that, we would strike a blow against the wicked Catholic Spanish Empire. The Spanish Catholics and the Protestant English are going to become deadly enemies, and they're going to commit atrocious crimes on each other and their people's bodies in the name of their religion. So we got Spain in the north of the New World. France in the north of the New World. We got Spain in the south of the New World. So that worthless middle's all left for England. And to get people over, she promised them there's a lot of land there. And land was something that you just didn't have in Europe. As I pointed out on the map, it's very small. The only people that had land were either nobility or royalty. There just wasn't any land to go around. But you could come over to this new land, the New World, and have plenty of land, and there's plenty of animals, and you could kill the animals and trade the fur. You could go to mine if you want to. Maybe there's some minerals over there. And it's a place for we can send our retired soldiers to live. It's a place to send prisoners. It's a place to send a surplus, unworking population. It's going to be a dumping ground. This is a pamphlet published in 1609 promoting the immigration to Virginia. As I said, land for common men was scarce, especially when they started something called the Enclosure Act. When they started, at one time, all the land was open and anybody could raise their cattle. But when they started trying to enclose the land and fence it in, some of the people didn't have any place to farm their animals, and they had to go to the city to be poor. Meanwhile, prices are rising in England, and thousands are unemployed and homeless. And under Henry VIII and Elizabeth II, they could be whipped, branded, hanged, forced into the military simply because they didn't have a job. Elizabeth even got a law passed to regulate wages, and anyone unemployed had to accept work or be forced to migrate to the New World. So it looked like they were trying to solve the overpopulation problem, and maybe it was. Because freedom in England was perceived as you controlled your own labor. If you worked for wages, you were seen as being servile. And of course, the greater population feared being unemployed, and they feared those that were unemployed walking around England. So send them to the New World. They can gain land and they can work at their own labor. So the promise of independence and land drew thousands. Not riches, not getting gold, not religious freedom, just independence and land. But immigration was risky because, I mean, you've got the Indians here, you've got political and economic tensions in the groups that settled, you've got imperial wars going on, you've got diseases, you've got conflicts with the Indians, you had a good chance of dying. But economic conditions were so bad in England that more than 500,000 left England. And not all of them went to the New World, of course. Some went to Ireland, some went to, they didn't stay long in Ireland. Some went to the West Indies, and they were mostly the young single men, and they were mostly from the lower ranks of society. And they settled in the tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Labor was in very high demand because there's so much land and just not enough people to work it. A lot of them settled in New England, and the middle colonies are what we call the bread colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So how are you going to get here if you don't have any money? Well, you're going to basically sell your soul to the devil. You're going to surrender your freedom for passage to the New World and agree to work for someone for 5 to 7 years. And of course, you do this to the boat captain, and when the boat captain gets to the New World, he sells your contract, and you're basically sold as a slave. You couldn't get married. You could be punished. Anything that you broke, you had to work longer to pay for. The rules and regulations were very strictly enforced, and you could even be resold. But once your contract was up, if you lived for 5 or 7 years, they had what they call freedom dues. And the freedom dues at one time included 50 acres of land and a set of clothing and something to get you started on your own. But a lot of them didn't live long enough to gain freedom because being an indentured servant was extremely hard. This is just a copy of an indentured contract where the man sold his soul to come to the New World. But land was the key to being a free man. If you had land, you had control over your work. It gave you the right to vote, so you could participate in politics. You could support your family, so you were somebody. The problem we're running into is we've got more land than workers. And as you can see, that's going to present some problems. The English, they're very egotistical. They had no desire to convert the Indians. They didn't want to assimilate with them. What they wanted, the Indians' land. And when they first got here, of course, the Indians welcomed them. Some Englishmen thought that since the Indian did not work the land, they didn't have any right to claim it. Yeah, there were some who bought land, but for the most part, even with a few treaties and a few baubles exchanged, they had no respect for the Indian whatsoever. And as for mixed marriages, well, of course, the most famous was John Roth and Pocahontas, but for the most part, it was discouraged. And in 1691, there was even a law against it. Of course, once the Englishmen had arrived, or any of the Europeans, the Indians' lives did change. They began to depend upon the English goods and alcohol. And with more contact with English, the tribes began to fight each other over who's going to trade with who. And the Indians were very wasteful when it came to wild animals because they didn't want. They wanted the what they wanted the fur only. They leave the carcasses to rot. So pretty soon you not only deplete the forests by taking down the trees, but you have also killed off the game. And you brought diseases. And the English had this strange habit. They'd take a piece of land, and contrary to what the Indian believed of, everybody uses land, they'd put a fence around it and wouldn't let the Indian back on. And they allowed their stock to roam free over any land. Now I'm going to take you through some of the colonies. The Jamestown colony was founded in 1607 by the private Virginia Land Company. And they had settlement requirements. It was a stock company. You could either buy stock or you could come over and get paid back later. The stock company stayed in England, and when they sent their first group of settlers over, they sent over a box, and inside the box was the people that they wanted them to run the colony. And one of the men that came over was a Captain John Smith. He was an adventurer. Actually, he was the only colonist who came over to Jamestown who had ever had any fighting experience. And he'd earned his spurs, as they said, fighting the Turks. And he was captured. And guess what? A Turkish princess helped him escape. And he barely made it back in England in time to get on the boat to come to the New World. Well, when they opened up the box, they found out that this man they didn't like, this egotistical fella, because he wasn't a gentleman, he was a military man. He ran the colony for 2 years. And during the 2 years he ran the colony, although the colony was not happy because he had the rule, you don't work, you don't eat. They were very unhappy with him. One day he's captured by a group of Indians, and this is where the story of Pocahontas comes in, and it's nothing like the movie Pocahontas. Was he captured by the Indians? Yes. Did Pocahontas save his life? It's more than likely, because they had the custom at that time that a high member of the tribe, such as the chief or one of his family or a real, well-known warrior, could ask for and receive the life of a prisoner. It's possible, but at the time, Pocahontas was only 12 years old. It's possible. As a matter of fact, we have studies where they Pocahontas used to come into Jamestown, strip stark naked, and turn cartwheels going down the street, drive everybody crazy. But like I said, she was a child. But there was an accident, gunpowder explosion, which seems rather strange when Captain John Smith was badly burned and he returned to England and he never came back to Jamestown. That was in the spring of 1609. The winter of 1609 and 10 is called the starving time. It was bad. They're not farming, they're not planting. And of the 500 that were alive in 1609, there's estimates between 30 and 60 were still left in the spring of 1611. So they decided, we've had it, we're leaving. So they get on their boats and they start down the James River, and because they named the river the James River. And at the same time, ships are coming in, bringing in more colonists and more supplies that they're forced back. But Jamestown had a reputation as a killing field. But the survival rate was less than, 80% chance you're going to die. And they're not growing enough food to feed the colony. They seem to be unwilling or unable to feed themselves, and they keep demanding more and more food from the Indians. So the colony is definitely not working. So they requested a new form of government from the king. And the governor was given absolute power. We're not going to have any councilmen. I'll have one man in charge. But you see, the Virginia Company had sent over not men who were farmers who knew how, or carpenters. They had sent over perfumers and tailors and apothecaries. So these people, you had a strict social class in England. No matter what you were, that's all you did. And if the gentlemen who came over were second and third sons, a lot of them, looking for riches. And of course, they didn't feed themselves, so they brought their own cook. Well, the cook did nothing but cook. They'd bring a dresser who did nothing but help dress them. And that's all they did. So where you would hope maybe one man would go out and farm, you'd have 3 men doing absolutely nothing. Well, in 1614, John Rolfe, who had arrived after 10 years. They go to England, and she dies there. But meanwhile, he's combining West Indian tobacco with the Spanish tobacco and starts sending it to England. And it becomes a smash commodity hit. At first, it was just served in taverns, and then it became public. The pamphlet, published in 1609, publishing, I think we did this one before. So the Virginia Company and the colony of Jamestown was saved by the demon weed tobacco. In 1622, the Indians rebelled and killed more than 25% of Jamestown people. And the governor said, you know, the Indians have rebelled. They forfeited any right or claim they had to the land. And it didn't take long before the settlers overcame the Indians. But 20 years later, they're going to rebel again. This time a treaty is going to be forced on them and they're not going to come back. But in 1622, the king pulls a charter, totally. Now Jamestown is a royal colony. They don't have, the Virginia Company no longer has any say. Chesapeake Bay. You see, you've got Maryland here and Delaware. You got Maryland and here's Delaware. But this area right here is called the Chesapeake Bay area, and this whole area is called the Chesapeake Bay. And you've got the James River, we've got Jamestown. And this was part of the requirements from the Virginia Company. You were going to settle far enough inland so that the Spanish ships couldn't see you, yet you should have access to other rivers so you can make friends with the Indians. Now, King James I thought the tobacco was harmful to humans, but a lot of people enjoyed it. They even thought it was healthy. So Virginia's tobacco is going to become their gold. And even though King James did not like or approve of the tobacco, he certainly didn't mind taking the taxes from it. And all of a sudden there's a big rush from immigrants to gain land for tobacco. And unfortunately, there was a small number who got there and got the best land. And they're going to wind up becoming the aristocracy of Virginia. They also are going to have an elected House of Representatives called the House of Burgesses. The first elected assembly in the New World. But things are going to get better. They're going to start living longer. And there is a study, and although it's not mentioned in your text, I will not ask you any questions about it. It's just kind of an off-the-wall type thing. They were doing some excavating at the site of Jamestown a few years ago, and they were having trouble finding where Jamestown was. And they finally realized that the James River had changed course, and where they were digging wasn't where the original settlement was. So when they finally found the original site of the settlement and started digging, they find bones. And they're bones of white men, and they've got bullets in them. And they find bones of other white men who've not in good shape, and they finally figured out that there were some executions going on in Jamestown. They were killing each other. And then they found something that really blew their mind. As I said, the Catholics and the Protestants hated each other. England and Spain hated each other with pea-purple passion. They found a crucifix. And as I stated before, for those of you who don't realize, a crucifix has the emblem of Christ on it being crucified, whereas a cross just has just a plain cross. Now, since the crucifix is a symbol of the Catholic Church, there's no way a good Protestant would ever have this. So why was a Catholic cross in a Protestant area? Well, a little bit more investigation, they discovered that one of the original members of Jamestown settlement had a cousin who lived in northern England who was against the crown, who was Catholic. And they did a little bit more investigation, and it seemed that for about 2 years, within 2 weeks after a supply ship left Jamestown, there would be either an outbreak of smallpox, something would burn down, there'd be some disaster would happen. So now this is all circumstantial, but they reached the conclusion that there was a spy in Jamestown who really was Catholic and doing everything he could, or else he was in the pay of the Spanish, doing everything he could to destroy the settlement. True or false, I don't know. And like I said, the items that were found were found, but it's circumstantial. But anyway, by 1700, the population of Jamestown had grown to over 90,000. But men are outnumbering the women 5 to 1. So in 1620, just a few years after the settlement, they start bringing over women they call tobacco brides. They brought them over as indentures to marry the tobacco farmers. Excuse me. But with the high death rate combined with having to complete an indenture, women, well, they didn't begin their families till quite late. Even they came over at 16, 17, 18, they'd be in their 20s before they could, middle to late 20s before they could start. And of course, the patriarchal rule was very difficult. A lot of husbands did die before the children were raised, which was, well, that was good for the woman. Because a widow was entitled to 1/3 of husband's property. But then if she dies, all that she had inherited goes to her husband's male heirs. But something called a femme sole, a woman alone. If you weren't married, if you were a widow, you could manage your own property, you could own property, you could make decisions. It was yours. But the minute you got married, everything became your husband's. So a lot of women, some of them lost a couple, 2 or 3 husbands through death by disease or Indian attack, and they wound up with a lot of property. Where's even 1 or 2 stories I've come across where while a lady is burying her husband at the gravesite, and somebody would propose marriage to her. Because a young woman who was able to cook and have children was a very highly sought after commodity. She didn't have to be pretty. She didn't have to be, as long as she was female and could cook and have babies. But most women came over as indentures and they lived the same hard life as a male indenture. Meanwhile, the Marian exiles had come back as Puritans, like I said, when James I became king. Well, actually, they started coming back when Nesbitt was a king. But the Puritans, they thought the Church of England or the Anglican Church was way too Catholic. They thought that the priest should be able to marry. And there's elaborate ceremonies with vestiges of, if you've ever been to a Catholic ceremony, if you're not Catholic, it's quite a lot of ceremony. They thought the congregation should choose the clergyman. It shouldn't be appointed by the government. Sometimes they were called the Congregationalists, and what they wanted to do was to purify the Anglican Church. So when James I came marching in from Scotland to take over the throne, they met him on the road to London and made demands. Oh, not good. It's just a picture of what the Puritan man and Puritan woman dressed like, very well covered up. James I hated them and went out of his way to make it very difficult for them. Because the Puritans, they hated Catholicism. They urged the believers to see the truth through the Bible. And they followed a man called John Calvin. Now, John Calvin believed in predestination, which meant that God decides before you're born whether you're going to be saved or whether you're going to go to hell. And since he was God, nothing you can do because you're going to change his mind. But if you led a good life and you were healthy and you were prospering, it was a pretty good indication you might be one of the elect. But if you didn't have a good job and you were always sick, chances are you were one of God's damned. Let's take a quick look at some of the New England colonies. Plymouth. The Virginia Company agreed to let a group of pilgrims settle even though they were obnoxious. Now this group of pilgrims was the worst. They're called separatists. They believed that they were God's chosen and everybody else was going to hell. And they were radical, and even the Puritans in England didn't want anything to do with them, so they went to Holland. Well, when they got over there, they had trouble. They were still poor and small group, and like I told you in the first chapter, the Netherlands was the place to be, very progressive, and their children were leaving the church. So the congregation getting smaller and smaller. So they decided to migrate to the New World after getting permission from the Virginia Company. They came over on a boat, which called the Mayflower. Yes, there really was a Mayflower. And because of an accident, who knows what, it didn't land in the Virginia area. It landed north of the Virginia colony in a place called Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1620. Now, the leader was a man named William Bradford. He was born in Yorkshire, England, and very early he expressed his desires to join the Separatist Church. I think at the age of 17. And when he came over here, he was a very rigid leader. He served 31 one-year terms as governor of the colony of Plymouth. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony were Puritans, or Reformed Calvinists, but they were non-separatists. Now, see, the Pilgrims are separatists, the Puritans are non-separatists. They want to purify the church. And King James didn't like them. He didn't want the Church of England's doctrine contaminated in any way. And when the Puritans heard that the king was going to try to get rid of them, they decided to migrate in something called the Great Migration. In 1630 to 1640, tens of thousands of them left England to go to the New World. But they came over as a superior group than the Pilgrims because they came over in a family group. They were better educated. There was more of them, and they had a common purpose to create a community dedicated to the glorification of God. And they brought the charter with them. Now, only once they converted the charter to a frame of government, that only free men could vote. Now, what is a free man? Well, there were very few of them. They had to be self-appointed saints. They had to meet all the regular. I think it's something like maybe 24 out of a couple of hundred could vote, and they were intolerant of anybody who dissented. John Winthrop led this particular one for 12 annual terms as governor, and he opposed something called unconstrained democracy. He thought democracy was a bad thing. Very wealthy lawyer, leading figure, very stern. But everybody didn't like what was going on, and we have two very well-known, shall we say, those who opposed. Roger Williams, Cambridge graduate and a minister. He came to the New World, and he argued that the civil authority had no right to judge religious matters. What he wanted was a total separation of church and state. He said, you can't just go out and take the land from me, and you need to buy it. And by the way, women should have some rights. Well, this was not only heresy, it was terrible. You can't have this. So they banished him. So he left Massachusetts and he moved south to set up a refuge for dissenters. He named his little area he was going to live in Providence. And in 1643, he finally managed to grant independence. He was given permission to grant independence as a colony of Rhode Island. So that little bitty piece of land just south of Massachusetts is where the dissenters that did not like the way things were going, that thought that you should buy, land from the Indians. You should let women have some rights. Another dissenter was a lady called Anne Hutchinson, educated well beyond her station as a woman and in theology. And she follows her minister, Cotton Mather, to the Boston area. And she hosted religious discussions weekly in her home, very nonconformist. She didn't believe in attending regular services, and she didn't dress modestly. She stressed direct communication with God. And the governor declared this anarchy, and they arrested her. They labeled it Antonianism. Well, there's more to this than meets the eye. The followers of her grew, and they voted the governor out of office. But Winthrop's followers fought back, and they got him back in office, and they arrested her for contempt and sedition. And she was 9 months pregnant when she was forced to stand before a judge for 8 hours with no water, no bathroom privileges or anything. And if you've ever had a baby, young ladies, you know you don't stand for 8 hours when you're pregnant 9 months. Everything they asked her, she had an answer for. And a good answer. And finally, they're just about at their wits' end because they can't seem to find anything wrong. And they ask her, well, how do you know these things? And she made the mistake of saying, God told me. And when she said God had talked to her individually, she signed her own warrant. Because God does not talk to individuals, especially a woman. So she was banished, her whole family, and she went to Rhode Island. But the biggest problem was she had family, cousins and brothers and things like this, who were very influential. And there was disagreements over the land titles in this area. And they were so strong that they couldn't go after them, but they went after her. So first she went to Rhode Island, and she didn't like it there, so then she went to a Dutch settlement along the Hudson River, where very shortly thereafter she and her entire family were killed by Indians in 1643. And we have since found out that that group of Indians only killed the one family. Hers was the only family that was wiped out. And it was a group of Indians from the Massachusetts Bay area. There again, circumstantial evidence. We don't know for sure. But the Puritans' legacy is secular, not spiritual. These Puritans had metamorphosed from the Puritans and being very religious to our Yankee trader. They believed in devils. They held witch trials. They held blue laws. Had very strict moral imperatives. But their practical contributions were Harvard College. At the first printing press, they put emphasis on education. You could punish the family if the family did not teach the children how to read and write or send them to school. But the government was run by the church, basically. So you could say the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy, not a democracy. Roger Williams got the charter, and in his colony they had complete religious freedom. So what about Connecticut? Well, a man named Thomas Hooker founded Hartford, Connecticut, basically for the fur trade, and the people who went to Hartford were people who couldn't get along with the rigid church rules in Boston. And it's in Connecticut that the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were written, which is the first written constitution in the colonies. The others had taken their charters and changed them into ways of running government, but the first actual constitution was in Connecticut. New Hampshire and Maine, two men by the name of George and Mason got grants from the king for the region north of Massachusetts. George took the region next to the coast, which was going to become Maine. Mason took the western part of it, will become New Hampshire. And both of these regions looked to Massachusetts for the government, and it was taken over by the Bay Colony very shortly. Discovered with a few people they needed more government and help than they could do. In 1679, King Charles II made New Hampshire a separate royal colony. Maine stayed part of Massachusetts until 1820, when it came into the United States as a state. Vermont did not exist as a chartered colony. She belonged to New York until 1791. And in 1791, she became our 14th state. It formed something called the New England Confederation in 1643, which consisted of Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, and they met to determine how to take care of the Indians. Rhode Island was not invited. But each one felt that they should lead the area, they should make the decisions, and since they didn't get along, they were ineffective is a good word. They didn't get anything done. Now the southern colonies. We've already talked about the Virginia Company in Jamestown, so let's jump to Maryland. Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, got a grant from the king to found a refuge for English Catholics. But he died before he had a chance to do it. His son Cecilius inherited the charter, and I think if I had a son, I would never name him Cecilius. So they made a settlement called St. Mary's, and it prospered. They looked south, and they learned from Jamestown's mistakes. But they ran it like the old English feudal system. They had a governor and a council and an elected assembly. But things got so bad that pretty soon the Protestants were outnumbering the Catholics, and they were not getting along, and it was a time of troubles. So in 1649, the Toleration Act was passed to protect the now minority Catholics. You get freedom of worship if you believed in the divinity of Christ. And they grew tobacco. Carolinas. Carolina actually is a word that's a French version of Carlos, French for Charles. Now, Charles II of England granted 8 of his loyal friends land south of Virginia. And Charlestown was established in 1670. And the original plan was for the whole area to be a garden for the island plantations, because the less land you had to use for food, the more land you could grow sugar on. They even asked John Locke to form a government, but he said no, and the feudal system they were using was unworkable, and they had to go to a representative government. But by 1700, they realized rice is the way to go. In 1685, we began to hear the term North Carolina. But North Carolina didn't become a separate colony until 1729. And North Carolina developed small farms, where South Carolina developed plantation and became very aristocratic. And a lot of the people in North Carolina were people who, like people went to Rhode Island to get away from Boston. People went to North Carolina to get away from Virginia and the South Carolina rules. It was full of people who did not get along well with other people. They were a very hardy group of people in North Carolina. Georgia was the last colony to be formed. And if you've ever been to Georgia, you'll see the name Oglethorpe on everything. James Oglethorpe got a grant in 1732, and his first colony was Savannah. He'd been begging for this grant for years, and he said, well, it'd be a refuge for the poor debtors. Nah. It'll provide a haven for persecuted Protestants from Europe. Nah. It'll convert the Indians. Nah. But number 2, it's going to create a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida, which means that the Spanish, if they want to attack the prosperous Charlestown, they're going to have to come through Georgia. That's the one that persuaded the king to give him the buffer. They based their economy on silk and wine, and they brought in vegetables. They tried everything, and nothing worked. They couldn't have more than 50 acres of land. They couldn't sell land, and they could not have slaves. And these poor people in Georgia are looking up at how prosperous Virginia is, how prosperous Charleston is, how prosperous they are in Maryland, and it's just not going. So in 1751, the king pulls the charter. It becomes a royal colony, and all those restrictions are gone. You can have slaves, you can buy and sell land, and you can grow whatever you want to grow. So Georgia became prosperous also. So that's the southern colonies. Basically Virginia, South and North Carolina, and Georgia. The middle colonies, they're called the breadbasket. The former Dutch colony of the New Netherlands, as we learned last chapter, was lost to England in commercial wars. And as soon as the war was over, King Charles II gave all the land to his brother, the Duke of York. Everything between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers. And New York was very autocratic. It was the least democratic of all the colonies. The Duke of York transferred part of his land to others and became New Jersey. Now, the Dutch were already there, and they had liberal terms for buying land, and the English were attacked. Apparently, New Jersey had great farmland at the time. Now, when I was in New Jersey, it didn't show me much, but it's supposed to be a great farming state. In 1674, Quakers purchased portions of it, and in 1702, New Jersey became a royal colony, and it was united. Then you've got Pennsylvania. William Penn, philanthropic experiment. He wanted a place for the refuge for the English Quakers. Now, whereas you've got the Puritans and the Pilgrims in New England, and you've got the Catholics in Maryland, now we want a place for the Quakers. So he gets a grant from the king to actually repay him for some money he'd lent the king. He called his colony the Holy Experiment, and it was settled entirely by Quakers. They treated the Indians fairly. That they actually paid them for their land. You couldn't buy land until you had a clear title. And they attracted a lot of hard-working Germans. This is where you get the Black and German Dutch. And there's a variety, a lot of settlers and good farmland. Now, Delaware, when you look at the map, looks like it should be a southern state. It was originally founded by the Swedes, and the Dutch captured it. But it was part of the grant to the Duke of York. In 1682, William Penn buys the area to have access to the sea for Pennsylvania because he was landlocked. By 1702, they could select their own assembly, but the Penn family still selected the government. And there were also other colonies. There were Bermuda and St. Christopher and Barbados and Jamaica, and these were all known for growing sugar. And it was because of these islands that the Carolinas were formed. More land for sugar. Now, all the colonies had some things that were the same and some that were different. They all had elected assemblies. And 12 of the 13 colonies were bicameral, had 2 houses, and one was unicameral, which was 1 house. These elected assemblies could pass acts, but the acts could be vetoed in most cases by the governor or the king. Each colony had its own voting rules. Women, slaves, Indian indentures, non-Christians, and propertyless individuals that could not vote. In some colonies, especially in the New England area, they had religious requirements. But the main requirement was you had to belong to the right religion. You had to own property, and above all, you had to be a white male. So there's basically 3 types of colonies. Proprietary colony, which is joint stock or individual. The corporate colony, which is the charter for the colony is held by the colony. It's a self-governing colony. No colony ever started out as a royal colony. You only became a royal colony when the king pulled your charter. You were either proprietary or corporate. In each colony, you had a governor. He was the chief executive. He was either appointed or selected in the corporate colonies. He couldn't be appointed. He was selected in the corporate colonies. In the proprietary colony, the joint stock individuals would select him. You had an elected assembly, except in the South. This elected assembly, I said, had the power of the purse. The power of the purse simply meant you had the power to tax. Then you had, and the elected assembly was kind of like our lower house. You had a council, which was appointed by the governor, which would be kind of like our upper house for the senators, but they had no power. So every colony had a governor, either appointed or selected. Every colony had an elected assembly. which could pass laws, which could be vetoed. But they had the power of the purse, which gave them a lot of power, because if they had the power of the purse, they had the power to pay the governor, so they could blackmail the governor. And then you had the council, which were supposed to be advisors to the governor. Now, colony charter that they had usually served as a constitution for the colonies. But the main thing to remember is that the ones who came over here from England retained all rights and privileges of Englishmen. They were the same in the New World as they were in the Old World. In the New England colonies, you had town meetings, which were very democratic, even if you were a democracy. In the southern counties, you had a county form of government. You had the sheriffs and the justices of the peace, and you had the parish as a subdivision of the county. And I can remember when I was going to school, I used to think that Louisiana had to be the most religious of all states, because look at all those parishes. And I thought parish was had to do with the church parish. I was quite disappointed when I found out that parish was just simply another name for county. In the middle colonies, which was the breadbasket, they had a mixture of both town meetings as well as justices. In all the counties, the judges were appointed by the governor. And there was no such thing as political parties. You had regional interest groups, but no political parties. Now, these are the English monarchs before our revolution. We talked about the Tudors, Henry VII, who began the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII, Edward dying real young, and then Mary and Elizabeth. And then when Elizabeth dies, James VI of Scotland becomes James I. His son becomes King Charles I. He gets beheaded. We'll learn about him very shortly. And James II, Charles II, William and Mary Anne. And once Anne dies, there's no more direct blood back to Henry VII, so we have to go to the Germans. And we get George I, II, and III. Now the only reason I've got these up here is because when we have wars, it's going to have Anne's War and William and Mary's War and George's War. They're usually named for the king or queen. Okay, King James rules, especially the settlement in the New World. He dies, and his son, King Charles, becomes the king. King Charles believes in divine rule and is very upset because the Parliament won't let him tax as much as he wants to. So the Puritans have a revolution, and they overthrow the king, and they behead him. It's the only time a king of England's ever beheaded. King Charles I is beheaded. Now Oliver Cromwell becomes the ruler for 15 years. He's a dictator. He also was one of the leaders of the revolution. When he dies, his son tries to take over, but it didn't work. So after 16 years of having no king, the Parliament looks around and, we're the only nation in the world that doesn't have a king. So they invite the son of the executed King Charles, James I, to come in and take over. Well, it took a little while. But in about 2-3 years after Oliver died, his son is out, and James I comes in and rules. Well, James dies, and Charles II takes over. He has been living in France for 50-some years. He's still angry at the English people for executing his father. He's very, very Catholic, and he's got a Catholic wife, although it's a second wife. His first wife was Protestant, and she died. And he's bringing in Catholics, and it's just not going over well, so the Parliament decides this is enough. We need to do something. So they go to Charles II, first wife's children, who are Protestant, William and Mary, and yes, it's like the one William and Mary College is named after, and they invite them to take the throne. Well, they invite Mary first, and Mary says, I won't take the throne unless you offer to my husband, William of Orange. And he was thrilled to death to come over and be King of England, because this gave him access to money and soldiers. He could go back to Europe and fight Catholics. He hated Catholics. But when they took over the throne, there's more restrictions. Every time there's a new king or queen taking over, there's more restrictions. Now Parliament names successor. William and Mary can't say, I want this person to be the next monarch. And also, they write rules that no Catholic anywhere. Well, William and Mary didn't have any children. Mary dies first, and William, although the pictures of him show him to be like he's been sucking a lemon, he looks kind of sourpuss, he went into severe depression and mourning. And then one day he's out riding about 3 years after she dies. His horse throws him, and he breaks his leg and dies of blood poisoning. Well, what are you going to do? We don't want to go to the Germans. Well, Mary had a sister named Anne, who was a widow. They invited her to come over. I mean, she was very prolific. She had like 13 children, and none of them lived. But Anne was very much loved. She left Parliament alone. She let Parliament run the country. The Parliament loved her. The people loved her. They called her Queen Mom. But when she finally dies, we've got no choice. We've got to go to the German branch of the family, and we go to the Georges, and we have the George First, Second, and Third. George the First never left France, never left Germany, didn't speak a word of English. Parliament loved that. His son George the Second made trips over here, but he didn't really like it too well. He preferred the German beer. It's going to be his grandson, George the Third, that's going to be King of England, living in England, and very, very English when we have a revolution, 1776. Now we've gone through all the monarchies to go on. Next chapter, we get into a little bit more detail about the different colonies and what they did, and you learn a bit more about the wars and things that were going on. So I just don't like it when they give you colonies piecemeal. We'll learn a little bit about this colony, a little bit about that colony. I wanted to give you all the colonies, and as you can see, we've got Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. And as you can see, Maryland is located on both sides of Chesapeake Bay. Here's Delaware, purchased by William Penn so that Pennsylvania would have an outlet to the sea, and later became a state. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, you've got Connecticut, and here's a little video thing of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Maine is not one of the original 13 colonies, and this proclamation line of 1763 we get to a little bit later. So that pretty much takes us to the end of chapter 2. I'm going to introduce you to someone called John Green. John Green has a rather unique way of looking at history. He is a history professor, and he will reiterate some of the things I've told you, and he has, as I say, a different point of view. You may find him amusing, you may find him not amusing, but watch him with a grain of salt.
So nuts. Class is up. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to tell the story of how a group of plucky English people struck a blow for religious freedom and founded the greatest, freest, and fattest nation the world has ever seen. These Brits entered a barren land containing no people and quickly invented the automobile, baseball, and Star Trek, and we all lived happily ever after. Mr. Green, if it's really that simple, I am so getting an A in this class. Oh, me from the past. You're just a delight. So most Americans grow up hearing that the United States was founded by pasty English people who came here to escape religious persecution. And that's true of the small proportion of people who settled in the Massachusetts Bay and created what we now know as New England. But these Pilgrims and Puritans, there's a difference, weren't the first people or even the first Europeans to come to the only part of the globe we didn't paint over. In fact, they weren't even the first English people. The first English people came to Virginia. Off topic, but how weird is it that the first permanent English colony in the Americas was named not for Queen Elizabeth's epicness, but for her supposed chastity. Right, anyway, those first English settlers weren't looking for religious freedom, they wanted to get rich. So the first successful English colony in America was founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. I say successful because there were two previous attempts to colonize the region. They were both epic failures, the more famous of which was the colony at Roanoke Island, set up by Sir Walter Raleigh, which is famous because all the colonists disappeared, leaving only the word Croatan carved into a tree. Jamestown was a project of the Virginia Company, which existed to make money for its investors, something it never did. The hope was that they would find gold in the Chesapeake region like the Spanish had in South America, so there were a disproportionate number of goldsmiths and jewelers there to fancy up that gold, which of course did not exist. Anyway, it turns out that jewelers dislike farming, so much so that Captain John Smith, who soon took over control of the island, once said that they would rather starve than farm. So in the first year, half of the colonists died. 400 replacements came, but by 1610, after a gruesome winter called the Starving Time, the number of colonists had dwindled to 65. And eventually word got out that the New World's one-year survival rate was like 20%, and it became harder to find new colonists. But in 1618, the Virginia Company hit upon a recruiting strategy called the headright system, which offered 50 acres of land for each person that a settler paid to bring over. And this enabled the creation of a number of large estates, which were mostly worked on and populated by indentured servants. Indentured servants weren't quite slaves, but they were kind of temporary slaves, like they could be bought and sold, and they had to do what their masters commanded. But after 7 to 10 years of that, if they weren't dead, they were paid their freedom dues, which they hoped would allow them to buy farms of their own. Sometimes that worked out, but often either the money wasn't enough to buy a farm, or else they were too dead to collect it. Even more ominously, in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, the first shipment of African slaves arrived in Virginia. So the colony probably would have continued to struggle along if they hadn't found something that people really loved. Tobacco. Tobacco had been grown in Mexico since at least 1000 BCE, but the Europeans had never seen it, and it proved to be kind of a thank you for the smallpox, here's some lung cancer gift from the natives. Interestingly, King James hated smoking. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye and hateful to the nose, but he loved him some tax revenue, and nothing sells like drugs. By 1624, Virginia was producing more than 200,000 pounds of tobacco per year. By the 1680s, more than 30 million pounds per year. Tobacco was so profitable that colonists created huge plantations with very little in the way of towns or infrastructure to hold the social order together, a strategy that always works out brilliantly. The industry also structured Virginian society. First off, most of the people who came in the 17th century, 3/4 of them, were servants. So Virginia became a microcosm of England, a small class of wealthy landowners sitting atop a mass of servants. That sounds kind of dirty, but it was mostly just sad. The society was also overwhelmingly male, because male servants were more useful in the tobacco field. They were the greatest proportion of immigrants. In fact, they outnumbered women 5 to 1. The women who did come over were mostly indentured servants, and if they were to marry, which they often did because they were in great demand, they had to wait until their term of service was up. This meant delayed marriage, which meant fewer children, which further reduced the number of females. Life was pretty tough for these women, but on the upside, Virginia was kind of a swamp of pestilence, so their husbands often died. And that created a small class of widows or even unmarried women who, because of their special status, could make contracts and own property, so that was good, sort of. Okay, a quick word about Maryland. Maryland was the second Chesapeake colony, founded in 1632, and by now there was no messing around with joint stock companies. Maryland was a proprietorship, a massive land grant to a single individual named Cecilius Calvert. Calvert wanted to turn Maryland into like a medieval feudal kingdom to benefit himself and his family, and he was no fan of the representational institutions that were developing in Virginia. Also, Calvert was Catholic, and Catholics were welcome in Maryland, which wasn't always the case elsewhere. Speaking of which, let's talk about Massachusetts. So Jamestown might have been the first English colony, but Massachusetts Bay is probably better known. This is largely because the colonists who came there were so recognizable for their beliefs, and also for their hats. That's right, I'm talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And no, I will not be talking about Thanksgiving. Is a lie. I can't help myself, but only to clear up the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, and also to talk about Squanto. God, I love me some Squanto. Let's go to the thought bubble. Most of the English men and women who settled in New England were uber Protestant Puritans who believed the Protestant Church of England was still too Catholic-y with its kneeling and incense and extravagantly hatted archbishops. The particular Puritans, who by the way did not call themselves that, other people did, who settled in New England, were called Congregationalists because they thought congregations should determine leadership and worship structures, not bishops. The Pilgrims were even more extreme. They wanted to separate more or less completely from the Church of England. So first they fled to the Netherlands, but the Dutch were apparently too corrupt for them, so they rounded up investors and financed a new colony in 1620. They were supposed to land in Virginia, but in what perhaps should have been taken as an omen, they were blown wildly off course and ended up in what's now Massachusetts, founding a colony called Plymouth. While still on board their ship, the Mayflower, 41 of the 150 or so colonists wrote and signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, in which they all bound themselves to follow, quote, just and equal laws that their chosen representatives would write up. Since this was the first written framework for government in the U.S., it's kind of a big deal. But anyway, the Pilgrims had the excellent fortune of landing in Massachusetts with 6 weeks before winter, and they had the good sense not to bring very much food with them or any farm animals. Half of them died before winter was out. The only reason they didn't all die was that local Indians, led by Squanto, gave them food and saved them. A year later, grateful that they had survived mainly due to the help of an alliance with the local chief Massasoit, and because the Indians had taught them how to plant corn and where to catch fish, The Pilgrims held a big feast, the first Thanksgiving. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And by the way, that feast was on the fourth Thursday in November, not mid-October, as is celebrated in some of these green areas we call not America. Anyway, Squanto was a pretty amazing character, and not only because he helped save the Pilgrims. He found that almost all of his tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease, and eventually settled with the Pilgrims on the site of his former village, and then died of disease, because it is always ruining everything. So the Pilgrims struggled on until 1691, when their colony was subsumed by the larger and much more successful Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was chartered in 1629 by London merchants who, like the founders of the Virginia Company, hoped to make money. But unlike Virginia, the board of directors relocated from England to America, which meant that in Massachusetts they had a greater degree of autonomy and self-government than they did in Virginia. Social unity was also much more important in Massachusetts than it was in Virginia. The Puritans' religious mission meant that the common good was, at least at first, put above the needs or the rights of the individual. Those different ideas in the North and South about the role of government would continue until now. Oh god, it's time for the mystery document? The rules are simple. I read the mystery document, which I have not seen before. If I get it right, then I do not get shocked with this shock pen. If I get it wrong, I do. All right. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities? I don't know. For the supply of others' necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. Alright, first thing I noticed, the author of this document is a terrible speller, or possibly wrote this before English was standardized. Also, pretty religious individual. And the community in question seems to embrace something near socialism, abridging the superfluous for others' necessities. Also, it says that the community should be like a city upon a hill, like a model for everybody. And because of that metaphor, I know exactly where it comes from. The sermon, A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop. Yes! Yes! No punishment! This is one of the most important sermons in American history. It shows us just how religious the Puritans were, but it also shows us that their religious mission wasn't really one of individualism, but of collective effort. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. But this city on a hill metaphor is the basis for one kind of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are so special and so godly that we will be a model to other nations. At least as long, according to Winthrop, as we act together. Lest you think Winthrop's words were forgotten, they did become the centerpiece of Ronald Reagan's 1989 farewell address. Okay, so New England towns were governed democratically, but that doesn't mean that the Puritans were big on equality or that everybody was able to participate in government, because no. The only people who could vote or hold office were church members, and to be a full church member, you had to be a, quote, visible saint. So really, power stayed in the hands of the church elite. The same went for equality. While it was better than in the Chesapeake colonies or England, as equality went, pretty unequal. As John Winthrop declared, some must be rich and some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Or as historian Eric Foner put it, inequality was considered an expression of God's will, and while some liberties applied to all inhabitants, there were separate lists of rights for freemen, women, children, and servants. There was also slavery in Massachusetts. The first slaves were recorded in the colony in 1640. However, Puritans really did foster equality in one sense. They wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. In fact, parents could be punished by the town councils for not properly instructing their children and making them literate. But when Roger Williams called for citizens to be able to practice any religion they chose, he was banished from the colony. So was Anne Hutchinson, who argued that church membership should be based on inner grace and not on outward manifestations like church attendance. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, so that worked out fine for him. But Hutchinson, who was doubly threatening to Massachusetts because she was a woman preaching unorthodox ideas, was too radical and was further banished to Westchester, New York, where she and her family were killed by Indians. Finally, someone who doesn't die of disease or starvation. So Americans like to think of their country as being founded by pioneers of religious freedom who were seeking liberty from the oppressive English. But we've already seen that's only partly true. For one thing, Puritan ideas of equality and representation weren't particularly equitable or representational. In truth, America was also founded by indigenous people and by Spanish settlers, and the earliest English colonies weren't about religion, they were about money. We'll see this tension between American mythology and American history again next week, and also every week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson.
Told you he was a little bit different. Now that we have completed chapter 2, I think you need to do your short quiz and then answer the 4 questions pertaining to these 2 chapters. You do need to read chapter 2, even though you could not possibly follow the lecture with the chapter. As I said, the next chapter we get into more particulars on